Good morning. The following cybersecurity risk assessment presentation is presented by the United States team in response to the attempted intrusion that we had this morning on the United Kingdom's system network. Let's begin with a little background. An urgent situation arose this morning just hours before the opening of the summit of the Five Eyes countries, which is hosted here in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom detected exfiltration in its IDS intrusion detection system. It's likely that this pattern of network traffic could result in a buffer overflow or other vulnerability such as denial of service. Trust, however, between the Five Eye members still remains high, and it is believed that one of their individual networks may have been breached by a bad actor. Proper assessment of cybersecurity risk given the breach of one or more of the country's networks is definitely needed. It can be inferred that the network breach was likely to have taken place as a result of the improper use of user authentication, user authorization, or user access controls that allow access to each of the individual networks. With the cybersecurity risk framework in mind, let's move forward to the specific objectives. The first objective is for us to identify current measures for authentication. Secondly, we need to identify current measures for authorization. We also need to identify current measures for access control. We then need to determine weaknesses in the organization's security and also provide recommendations to correct any problems that we may encounter. Let's take a quick look at the definition of access control, authentication, and authorization. First of all, access control is a process by which users are granted access and certain privileges to systems, resources, or other information. Authentication is the process to validate users' credentials or their identity. It also is a process to verify that someone who is actually who they claim to be. Authorization is the process of giving someone permission or verifying their rights as we grant access to network resources. Authentication and authorization actually sound like very much the same thing, but let's take a look at the key differences. Authentication verifies that you are who you say you are. Some of the methods occur with login form, HTTP authentication, HTTP digest, X509 certificates, and then custom authentication methods. Authorization, on the other hand, decides if you have permission to access a specific resource. The methods used for authorization are access controls for URLs, secure objects and methods, and access control list, also known as ACLs. Some of the authentication methods include user password, use of certificates, use of pre-shared keys, network policy servers using Active Directory, authentication provided by servers that supports TACAS plus protocol, and authentication provided by servers that supports Radius protocol. Some of the other methods include authentication by a common method, which is two-factor. The use of two-factor uses information from two different items that must match up before you are authenticated as a user. They are typically something that the subject knows, like a password, passphrase, or PIN, something that the subject has, like a token, smart key, or keys, or something that the subject is, which is biometrics, fingerprints, voice, facial or retina patterns. Let's take a quick look at the internal authentication process. This process includes changes to internal users and internal authentication settings that are replicated to each of the firewalls. It also provides for access rules that contain authentication requirements that match those of the user records. The external authentication process provides for initial access to be granted to the user for the appropriate authorized services. Also, the performance of authentication based on the method associated with the user or the user's LDAP domain is often used. Current authentication measures that are being used include, but are not limited to, biometrics, retinal scans, fingerprint scans, facial recognition, the use of tokens, multi-factor, often called two-factor authentication, outbound use of mobile devices through text messages or phone calls that authenticate a transaction, and finally, the use of public key infrastructure authentication, which is also the use of digital certificates. Access controls are a collection of mechanisms that work together to protect the information assets of an organization from unauthorized access. Access control systems perform identification, authentication, and authorization of users of the network. The goal of access control is to safeguard unauthorized access to the system or network, either logically or physically, and maintain confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the organization's information system. More specifically, access controls supply a complete mechanism requiring auditing for accountability. These items include identification, authentication, authorization, and accountability, which is the auditing of transactions. In short, the transactions are audited to provide for who, what, and how, and when activity took place. Some of the specific threats related to access control include denial of services or DOS threats, unauthorized software, which would include malicious code, malware, or mobile code. Physical threats, which could result in eavesdropping or electronic manipulation of data. And personnel matters, which could be the result of a disgruntled employee. The proper application of access control measures includes the following: the application of patches for buffer overflow, disabling IP broadcast on routers, configuring host-based firewall or server operating systems to block ICP echo requests, hardening servers or installing H-IDS to prevent them from becoming bots, setup of NIPS at the edge or the perimeter of the network, active monitoring of H-IDS, N-IDS, N-IPS, and syslogs for anomalies, the practice of good software development life cycle or SDLC processes that include code inspection and frequent walkthroughs, and also programmer using implementation of parameter checks and enforcing data set rules. As we review the vulnerability assessment matrix that has been created for the event, we note that we should continue to mediate the threat of unpatched software by the team using the proper patch automation and automating with the Nessus patch management system. Also, we need to look at any insufficient or outdated firewalls by remediating this risk with reconfiguration of the firewall to comply with standard practice. Unrestricted internet access or lack of policies to enforce social engineering must be remediated by the team by the user's access only to safe websites and filtering of those that are inappropriate. Unencrypted wireless connections should be mitigated by the proper placement of data encryption and proper access control methods for wireless connections. Unreported or missing ID badges or access cards should be mitigated by strict enforcement policies and procedures regarding employees and access control methods. As we review potential weaknesses in the United States or other Five Eyes member organizations' cybersecurity, we must note that these weaknesses may be technical, such as a flaw in code or design of software or hardware, or in processes, policy, or possible human weaknesses, which are operational weaknesses. The weaknesses include unpatched software, unencrypted wireless connections, weak hardware configurations, the lack of security policies and the enforcement of the same, insufficient IDP and IPS protocol, insufficient firewall, or possible technical flaws in software and hardware creating backdoor access to the network systems. As we review recommendations for the United States network, we should recognize that risks that have minimal effect on the organization may be mitigated by simply moving on. However, the team recommendation for the United States is to continue to review controls such as data encryption, the use of content filtering, patch automation, and continue to mitigate threats that are identified in the vulnerability matrix. We need to also review strict enforcements of the policies that were in place before the event and mitigate all of the potential risks that have been identified. Cybersecurity threats can never be eliminated. Hence, identifying vulnerabilities and threats, which should be a continuous process, evaluating and prioritizing risk based on the agency tolerance level and the risk appetite, and applying resources to constrain, plus the implementation and mitigation strategies necessary to reduce potential risk is always our best course of action. Part of our charge as a member of the Five Eyes Summit is to assist our other Five Eye members in their cybersecurity needs. With this in mind, the recommendations are that the risk response, again, must be evaluated, and those risks that are minimal in nature, we just need to move on. We also need to collaborate and review the controls of other members, such as data encryption, the use of content filtering, patch automation, the mitigation of threats that are identified in the vulnerability matrix. We also need to review with other members the enforcement of the policies that were in place before the event occurred and the mitigation of potential risks that are identified. We need a further review with our fellow members of their policies regarding access controls, authentication methods, and their authorization methods. Identification of the member or members that have been breached is absolutely essential. After the infected member is identified, it will be necessary for all members to collaborate to correct the deficiency of the breached member. 100% compliance among all members to correct all deficiencies is critical, and it is the only way to ensure the security and the integrity of the Five Eye Summit and networks. I'd like to thank everybody for your time, and at this time we'll take any questions or comments that you may have.